For 30 years, I have served the Whitmore family as their estate manager, maintaining their ancestral home in the Berkshire Hills of Massachusetts. In all that time, I have kept one promise above all others: never to enter the locked room on the 3rd floor of the East Wing. Until yesterday, I had honored that commitment without question. Today, I find myself compelled to break my silence about what transpired in those final moments before the door opened by itself and called me by a name I had not heard since I was 7 years old. The Whitmore estate spans 400 acres of pristine New England countryside. Its Georgian architecture, a testament to 2 centuries of accumulated wealth. The main house contains 47 rooms, each meticulously catalogued and maintained according to strict family protocols. All except one. Room 307 has remained sealed since my first day of employment in 1994. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, the family matriarch, made the restriction clear during our initial meeting. Under no circumstances was I to unlock that door, enter that space, or inquire about its contents. I accepted her terms without hesitation. In my profession, discretion is not merely expected, it is essential. Wealthy families harbor secrets as naturally as gardens harbor weeds. My role has always been to tend to what can be seen while ignoring what lies beneath the surface. For 3 decades, this arrangement served us both well. The locked room became simply another architectural feature, as permanent and unremarkable as the marble columns in the foyer. The room's location made avoidance relatively simple. Situated at the far end of a corridor rarely used by the family or staff, 307 existed in a quiet pocket of the house where footsteps echoed and dust gathered undisturbed. The hallway leading to it contained only storage closets and a single guest bedroom that Mrs. Whitmore never assigned to visitors. Even the housekeeping staff understood to limit their attention to the first 6 doors, leaving the 7th untouched. Over the years, I noticed certain peculiarities about the space. The door itself was unremarkable, solid oak with brass fittings consistent with the rest of the house. But it possessed an unusual weight that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. When I walked past during my weekly inspections of the East Wing, my footsteps would suddenly become muffled as I approached, resuming their normal cadence only after I had moved beyond the door's immediate vicinity. The key to room 307 hung on a separate ring in Mrs. Whitmore's private study, distinct from the master set that governed every other lock in the house. I glimpsed it only once, during an emergency repair to the adjacent guest room's heating system. It was larger than the others, made of an oddly tarnished brass that seemed to darken the longer one looked at it. Mrs. Whitmore noticed my glance and quietly moved the key ring to a drawer, closing it with a soft but definitive click. My curiosity about the room was never entirely absent, but it remained manageable for decades. The estate provided ample responsibilities to occupy my attention, coordinating seasonal maintenance, overseeing staff schedules, managing the grounds, and ensuring the seamless operation of a property that had hosted senators, ambassadors, and titans of industry. The Whitmores valued perfection in all things visible, and I took pride in delivering precisely that. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore passed away last autumn at the age of 83, leaving the estate to her only surviving child, Jonathan Tews, who had spent most of his adult life in London managing the family's international investments. Upon his return for the funeral, Jonathan expressed his intention to modernize certain aspects of the property while preserving its historical character. He spoke enthusiastically about converting unused spaces into contemporary amenities, a wine cellar, a home theater, perhaps a private art gallery. During our initial meeting to discuss these renovations, I presented him with the complete inventory of available rooms, carefully omitting any mention of 307. Jonathan studied the floor plans with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to evaluating properties for their maximum potential. His finger traced the layout of the 3rd floor, pausing when he reached the East Wing corridor. "This space here," he said, tapping the architectural drawing. It appears there should be another room, but I don't see it listed in your inventory." I explained that his mother had requested that particular space remain untouched, that it held personal significance she had never chosen to share. Jonathan accepted my explanation with the measured nod of a man who understood family eccentricities. He had grown up in this house, after all, and surely possessed his own memories of his mother's particular ways. We proceeded with planning the renovations for the other areas. The library would be expanded, the conservatory would receive new skylights, and the second-floor sitting room would be converted into a modern office space. Work began in early February, bringing contractors and their equipment into the normally serene environment of the estate. The sounds of construction, hammering, drilling, the mechanical whir of power tools filled rooms that had known only whispered conversations and the soft footfall of servants for generations. The noise created an odd atmosphere throughout the house, as if the building itself was adjusting to this sudden intrusion of modernity into its carefully preserved silence. It was during the third week of renovations that I first noticed the change in room 307. While conducting my evening rounds on a Tuesday in late February, I observed that the door appeared slightly ajar. The gap was minimal, perhaps half an inch, but unmistakable. I approached cautiously, assuming that the vibrations from the construction work had somehow loosened the door frame or shifted the building's foundation enough to affect the seal. When I pressed gently against the door to ensure it was properly closed, it resisted my touch with surprising firmness. The wood felt warm beneath my palm, which struck me as unusual given the consistently cool temperature of the East Wing's upper floors during winter months. I mentioned the incident to Jonathan the following morning, suggesting we contact a contractor to examine the door frame for any structural changes that might have resulted from the ongoing renovation work. He listened with polite attention but seemed more concerned with the progress of the library expansion than with the minor issue of a door that would not remain properly sealed. "Perhaps the house is simply settling," he said with a dismissive wave. "These old buildings have their own rhythms." His casual attitude toward the situation troubled me more than I cared to admit. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore had never regarded anything about room 307 as casual or dismissible. Her instructions regarding the space had carried the weight of absolute authority, delivered with an intensity that suggested consequences I had never wished to discover. Jonathan's apparent indifference to his mother's wishes felt like a betrayal of the trust she had placed in both of us. Over the next several days, the door continued its subtle rebellion against closure. Each evening, I would find it slightly open. Each evening, I would press it shut with increasing firmness, noting how the wood seemed to grow warmer with each contact. The brass doorknob began to show signs of tarnish that had not been present before, developing dark patches that resembled fingerprints despite the fact that no one had touched the handle for years. By the end of February, I had begun to feel an inexplicable sense of anticipation whenever I approached the East Wing corridor, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The renovations concluded in the first week of March, returning the estate to its customary quiet. The contractors departed with their tools and equipment, leaving behind transformed spaces that gleamed with fresh paint and modern fixtures. Jonathan expressed satisfaction with the results, noting how the improvements had brightened the entire house while respecting its historical integrity. The Whitmore estate had successfully bridged 2 centuries, honoring its past while embracing its future. Yet the silence that returned to the house felt different from the peaceful quiet I had known for 30 years. There was a quality of expectation in the air, a sense that something was preparing to emerge from the shadows of the family's carefully guarded privacy. The feeling was strongest in the East Wing, where the sounds of my footsteps seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed. On the evening of March 7th, a Tuesday that had begun like any other, I completed my final rounds at precisely 9:30, as had been my custom for 3 decades. The main floors were secure, the staff had retired to their quarters, and Jonathan had settled into his study with a book and a glass of wine. The estate rested in the comfortable rhythm of another day successfully managed. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor for my customary inspection of the guest rooms and storage areas. The East Wing corridor stretched before me, illuminated by the soft amber light of the wall sconces. As I approached room 307, I noticed that the door stood completely open for the first time in 30 years. The open door revealed nothing but darkness within, yet somehow that absence of light seemed more profound than mere shadow. I stood in the corridor for several long moments, studying the threshold that had remained inviolate for so many years. No sound emerged from the room's interior. No movement disturbed the perfect stillness. Yet I felt an unmistakable presence waiting just beyond the reach of the hallway's amber illumination. My first instinct was to close the door immediately and report the incident to Jonathan in the morning. The sensible course of action would have been to treat this as a simple mechanical failure. Perhaps the lock mechanism had finally succumbed to age death, or the recent construction vibrations had weakened the door frame beyond its ability to maintain a proper seal. These were rational explanations for what appeared to be an ordinary household malfunction. Instead, I found myself taking a single step closer to the threshold. The floorboard beneath my feet creaked with a sound I had never heard before in this corridor, a long, plaintive note that seemed to linger in the air far longer than wood and nails should have permitted. The darkness within the room appeared to shift slightly, not with movement, but with depth, as if layers of shadow were rearranging themselves in response to my approach. From somewhere within that impenetrable blackness came a sound so soft it might have been imagined. A whisper that carried my childhood name. Not Thomas, the name by which I had been known for decades in my professional capacity, but Tommy, the name my grandmother had used when I was 7 years old. The whisper had been so faint that I initially dismissed it as a trick of acoustics, perhaps the settling of old wood or the movement of air through the house's aging ventilation system. Yet, as I stood frozen in the corridor, I realized that the sound had carried an unmistakable intimacy, the particular inflection that my grandmother had used when calling me for supper at her small house in Vermont during the summers of my childhood. My grandmother had passed away 43 years ago, when I was still a young man fresh from college and uncertain about my future career path. She had been the one to encourage my interest in estate management, telling me that old houses needed caretakers who understood that buildings were more than mere structures. They were repositories of memory, keepers of family stories that demanded respect and discretion. I had not thought of those summer visits in years. Yet standing before room 307, I could suddenly recall the scent of her lavender soap and the way afternoon sunlight had filtered through her kitchen curtains. The memory struck me with such unexpected clarity that I almost turned away from the open door, overwhelmed by a grief I thought I had long since processed and accepted. But the darkness within the room seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat or the rhythm of slow breathing. Against every instinct of caution and professional propriety, I withdrew my small flashlight from my jacket pocket and directed its beam across the threshold. The light revealed a space I had never imagined could exist within the familiar architecture of the Whitmore estate. The room was larger than the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed, stretching beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam into shadows that seemed to absorb illumination rather than reflect it. The walls were lined with built-in shelving from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes bound in leather so dark it appeared almost black. A Persian carpet covered the center of the floor, its intricate patterns rendered in deep burgundy and gold, while a single chair sat positioned before a cold fireplace at the far end of the space. What disturbed me most profoundly was not the room's unexpected size or its carefully appointed furnishings, but the complete absence of dust. Every surface gleamed with the meticulous care of regular maintenance. Yet I knew with absolute certainty that no member of the housekeeping staff had ever set foot in this space. The air itself felt fresh and clean, carrying the faint scent of old books and wood polish that spoke of recent attention. On the small table beside the chair lay an open ledger, its pages filled with handwriting I recognized despite the impossibility of such recognition. The elegant script belonged to Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, but these entries bore dates from decades before my employment at the estate. Some pages contained what appeared to be household inventories. Others held personal reflections written in the measured prose of someone accustomed to documenting important family matters. My flashlight beam fell upon a particular entry dated September 15th, 1962. The text began with a simple declaration that would fundamentally alter my understanding of everything I thought I knew about the Whitmore family. Not today marks the 25th anniversary of Thomas's disappearance. I have maintained this record as my mother requested, though I increasingly question the wisdom of preserving memories that cause such persistent anguish. The room remains as it was the night he vanished, his toys arranged exactly as he left them, his small clothes still folded in the dresser drawers. I read the words twice before their full implication settled into my consciousness. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore had lost a son named Thomas in 1937, a tragedy she had never mentioned during our 3 decades of professional association. The coincidence of the name struck me as unsettling enough. But as I continued reading, the journal entries revealed details that made my hands tremble as they held the flashlight. Thomas was 7 when he disappeared from the nursery on the 3rd floor. The police investigation concluded that he had somehow wandered outside during the night and become lost in the woods, though his body was never recovered. Mother insisted we preserve his room exactly as he left it, believing that his spirit might return to familiar surroundings if given the proper opportunity. The nursery mentioned in Mrs. Whitmore's journal could only have been this very space, room 307. What I had assumed to be a simple locked room had actually been a shrine to a lost child, maintained in secret for generations. The careful preservation, the absolute prohibition against entry, the weight of grief that seemed to emanate from the unopened door. Everything suddenly possessed a heartbreaking clarity that left me questioning my own identity and purpose within this house. I continued reading by the light of my trembling flashlight, each page revealing new layers of the family's carefully hidden tragedy. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore's mother had indeed maintained the room as a shrine for decades, changing nothing, adding nothing, simply ensuring that young Thomas's possessions remained exactly as he had left them. The practice had continued until the mother's death in 1978, at which point Catherine had assumed responsibility for the silent vigil. "The room calls to me some nights," one entry read. "I hear his laughter echoing from behind the locked door, the same bright sound that once filled our mornings with joy. Mother warned me never to enter after dark, explaining that grief has a way of making the impossible seem real. Yet I find myself drawn to that threshold, wondering if love alone might be sufficient to bridge the gap between what was lost and what remains." As I read these intimate confessions, the beam of my flashlight began to dim despite the fresh batteries I had installed just days earlier. The growing darkness seemed to press closer around me, yet I felt no urge to retreat from the room. Instead, I found myself stepping fully across the threshold for the first time, drawn by an inexplicable certainty that this space held answers to questions I had never known to ask. The moment my foot touched the Persian carpet, the door behind me swung shut with a soft but definitive click. The sound of the lock engaging carried a finality that made my breath catch in my throat. In the complete darkness that followed, I heard the sound again, that soft whisper calling my childhood name. This time, however, it carried the unmistakable voice of a young boy, clear and bright with a particular inflection of a 7-year-old child. "Tommy," the voice said, and I realized with a clarity that defied rational explanation that I was hearing the lost Thomas Whitmore, the child whose disappearance had haunted this family for more than 8 decades. My flashlight had died completely, leaving me in absolute blackness. Yet somehow I could sense the presence of another person in the room, not threatening, not malevolent, but undeniably real in a way that transcended the usual boundaries between past and present. The air around me seemed to shimmer with an energy I could not name, carrying the scent of childhood summers and the faint echo of laughter that belonged to a time long before my birth. "Who is it, Tommy?" the voice repeated. And this time I understood that the child was not calling to me, but rather introducing himself. Thomas Whitmore, forever 7 years old, forever trapped in this carefully preserved space, had been waiting for someone who might finally hear his voice and understand his story. My grandmother had been right about old houses. They were indeed repositories of memory, keepers of stories that demanded both respect and witness. As I stood in that impossible darkness, I began to comprehend that my 30 years of service to the Whitmore family had been preparing me for this singular moment of recognition and responsibility. In the darkness, I felt a small hand slip into mine. The touch was gentle but unmistakably real, carrying the particular warmth of a living child's palm. Thomas's fingers were exactly as they should be for a 7-year-old boy, small, soft, with the slight stickiness that comes from handling toys and sweets. The physical contact dissolved any remaining doubt about the nature of my situation. I was holding hands with a child who had vanished from this room 87 years ago. "I've been waiting," Thomas said, his voice carrying the patient acceptance of someone who had grown accustomed to solitude. "Mother said someone would come eventually, someone who would understand why I couldn't leave." His words held no sadness, only a matter-of-fact clarity that suggested he had spent decades contemplating his circumstances and had reached his own conclusions about their meaning. As he spoke, a soft phosphorescent glow began to emanate from the walls themselves, revealing the room's true contents. What I had glimpsed briefly with my flashlight had been only a fraction of the space's carefully preserved details. Toy soldiers stood in perfect formation on a low shelf, their painted uniforms still bright despite the passage of time. A rocking horse occupied one corner, its mane brushed smooth and its leather saddle polished to a warm glow. The bed remained unmade, its covers thrown back exactly as they had been on the night of Thomas's disappearance. A small pair of pajamas lay crumpled on the floor beside it, as if their occupant had simply stepped out of them and vanished into the darkness between one moment and the next. "I remember that night," Thomas continued, his grip on my hand tightening slightly. "I woke up because I heard something calling from the walls themselves. Not a voice exactly, but something that knew my name and wanted me to follow it somewhere I had never been before." His description of that final night carried the careful precision of a memory that had been examined countless times, polished smooth by decades of recollection. As he spoke, I began to see translucent images flickering in the phosphorescent air around us. Scenes from that September evening in 1937 playing like fragments of an old film reel. A small boy sitting up in bed, his dark hair tousled from sleep, listening to sounds that seemed to emerge from the very foundations of the house. The same child climbing out of bed, his bare feet touching the cold floor as he followed something invisible toward the far wall of the nursery. "The wall opened," Thomas said simply. "Not like a door, but the way water opens when you step into a pond. I could see another place beyond it. Somewhere that looked like our house but older, quieter, full of people I thought I recognized." The images in the air showed him approaching a section of the wall that appeared solid to my eyes. Yet in the phantom projection, the surface rippled and parted like liquid stone. "I thought I would only be gone for a moment," he continued. "I thought I could step through and step back, the way you might test the temperature of bath water with your toe." The ghostly scenes continued to unfold around us, showing young Thomas stepping through what appeared to be solid masonry into a space that defied architectural logic. Beyond the rippling wall lay not another room of the estate, but what seemed to be the same nursery existing in a different time entirely. The furniture was identical, yet somehow older, more weathered, as if centuries rather than mere decades had passed. "There were others waiting for me," Thomas said, his voice taking on a note of wonder that suggested the memory still amazed him despite the passage of time. "The children who had lived in this house long before I was born. Generations of Whitmore sons and daughters who had heard the same call and followed it to the same impossible place." The phosphorescent images revealed shadowy figures of various ages, all bearing the distinctive features of the Whitmore bloodline, all wearing clothing from different historical periods. "They explained that our family carries something in its blood," Thomas continued. "A connection to the house that runs deeper than ownership or habitation. We are not merely residents of this estate. We are bound to it by ties that death cannot sever." His words carried the authority of someone who had spent decades learning truths that were never meant to be spoken aloud. I understood now why Mrs. Catherine Whitmore had maintained the room as a shrine, why she had forbidden entry with such absolute conviction. She had not been preserving the memory of a dead child, but maintaining a threshold between worlds that her brother continued to inhabit. "But why couldn't you return?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper in that phosphorescent chamber. If the wall opened once, surely it could open again. Thomas's small hand squeezed mine with surprising strength, and I felt the weight of his 8 decades of contemplation in that simple gesture. "And the passage only opens for the living," he replied. "Once you cross completely into that other place, you become part of it." The children who were there before me had made the same choice, following the call without understanding its permanence. The images around us shifted, showing the moment when young Thomas had taken that final step. The wall sealing behind him like water closing over a stone dropped into a deep pond. "I tried to return immediately," he continued, "but the wall had become solid again. The others explained that I would need to wait until someone from my family came looking, someone who shared the blood connection and possessed the will to listen." His voice carried no bitterness, only the patient acceptance of someone who had learned to measure time in decades rather than days. "Catherine knew," Thomas said. She could sense my presence in the room, could hear my voice calling to her on the nights when the boundary grew thin. But she was terrified of following me across that threshold, afraid that she would leave her own family forever bereaved. The phosphorescent glow brightened as he spoke, revealing details of the wall where his passage had occurred. Subtle marks in the masonry that suggested a doorway waiting to open once again. As Thomas spoke of his sister's long vigil, I began to understand the true weight of Mrs. Catherine Whitmore's secret burden. For more than 4 decades, she had maintained this room not merely as a memorial, but as a point of contact with a brother trapped between worlds. Every night she had resisted the temptation to join him, choosing instead to honor her obligations to the living while preserving hope for his eventual return. "She left instructions," Thomas said, gesturing toward the ledger that still lay open on the small table. When she realized that age would soon claim her, she began preparing for someone else to take responsibility for the threshold. Someone who could serve as a bridge between her world and mine. The phosphorescent images shifted again, showing Mrs. Whitmore in her final years, writing carefully in the journal while speaking softly to the empty air of the nursery. "She chose you," Thomas continued, "not because of your name, though she found comfort in that coincidence, but because she recognized in you the same qualities that had drawn our family to this calling for generations. Discretion, loyalty, and the ability to accept mysteries without demanding immediate explanations." His words carried the weight of revelation, suggesting that my 3 decades of service had been an extended audition for this singular moment of trust. I realized now that Mrs. Whitmore's death had been not merely the end of her own vigil, but the beginning of my inheritance of a responsibility I had never imagined possible. "Oh, what exactly are you asking of me?" I said, though I suspected I already knew the answer. The phosphorescent glow around us pulsed gently, and I could feel the presence of those other lost children Thomas had described. Generations of Whitmore descendants who had crossed into that impossible realm and remained there, waiting for resolution that only the living could provide. "The choice is yours," Thomas replied. "So you can leave this room, seal the door, and continue your service to my nephew as you always have. The threshold will remain, as it has for generations, and perhaps someday another caretaker will discover what you have found tonight." His small hand remained steady in mine, offering comfort rather than coercion, patience rather than pressure. "Or," he continued, "you can help us find our way home." The wall where his passage had occurred began to shimmer again, the masonry becoming translucent, revealing glimpses of that other realm where lost children wandered through halls that mirrored their family's estate. "We have learned much in our time between worlds," Thomas said. "Dor. We understand now that the call we followed was not meant to trap us, but to teach us something about the true nature of family, loyalty, and love." The phosphorescent images showed the other children gathering in their mirror nursery, all of them turning toward the threshold with expressions of hope and anticipation. "And we need someone who understands the weight of service," Thomas explained. "Someone who can guide us back across the boundary we crossed so long ago, back to the family we never meant to leave behind." Standing in that impossible room, holding the hand of a child who had been lost for nearly 9 decades, I felt the full weight of a decision that would alter not only my own existence but the very foundation of the Whitmore family's carefully guarded legacy. The phosphorescent glow around us seemed to pulse with expectation, and I could sense the presence of those other lost children gathering in their mirror realm, waiting for an answer. I was not certain I possessed the wisdom to provide. "What if I help you cross back?" I said carefully. "What becomes of this threshold? What prevents other children from being called into that space between worlds?" Thomas's expression grew thoughtful, and I realized that this question had occupied much of his contemplation during his long exile from the world of the living. "Well, the passage was never meant to be permanent," he replied. "It opened because our family's connection to this house had grown too strong, too concentrated in grief and isolation. We were called across because the boundary between past and present had become dangerously thin." His small face carried an ancient sadness that belonged to someone far older than his 7 years would suggest. "Our return will restore the natural balance," Thomas continued, "and the threshold will seal properly once we have completed our journey home, ensuring that no other children will be lost to the space between worlds." The images flickering in the phosphorescent air showed the wall returning to its normal solidity, the nursery resuming its role as a simple memorial rather than an active gateway to impossible realms. The implications of Thomas's explanation settled over me like a mantle of responsibility I had never sought but could not refuse. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore had spent her entire life maintaining this vigil, waiting for someone who possessed both the courage and the compassion necessary to complete a task that spanned generations. Her choice of me as her successor suddenly carried a weight that transcended mere estate management. "How do we begin?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Thomas's grip on my hand tightened with what felt like relief, and the phosphorescent glow around us brightened in response to my acceptance of the role destiny had prepared for me. You must call them by name," Thomas said. "Each child who crossed into that realm bears a Whitmore family name recorded in the estate's historical documents. Speaking their names while standing at this threshold will give them permission to return to the world they never meant to leave permanently." He gestured toward the shimmering wall, which had begun to show clearer images of the other lost children waiting in their mirror nursery. "The process will require several nights," Thomas continued. "The boundary can only accommodate one crossing at a time, and each child must be welcomed back individually, with full knowledge of who they were and when they disappeared." His explanation suggested a ritual of remembrance as much as rescue, a ceremony that would honor each lost life while restoring them to their proper place in the family's history. I spent the remainder of that first night in the nursery with Thomas, learning the names and stories of the children who had been lost to the threshold over the centuries. Each had followed the same inexplicable call. Each had intended only a brief exploration of the mysterious passage, and each had found themselves trapped in a realm that mirrored their family home while remaining fundamentally separate from it. Margaret Whitmore, aged 6, had vanished in 1843 during a fever outbreak that had claimed several family members. Samuel Whitmore, aged 8, had disappeared in 1879 on the night of his grandfather's funeral. The pattern revealed itself as I listened. The threshold opened during times of intense grief or loss, when the family's emotional connection to the house reached a peak of desperate longing for reunion with those who had passed beyond reach. Each crossing weakened the boundary, Thomas explained. What began as an occasional phenomenon became increasingly unstable, until my own disappearance in 1937 triggered the permanent opening that has persisted ever since. His voice carried the weight of someone who had spent decades analyzing the mechanics of his own tragedy. As dawn approached, I felt the phosphorescent glow beginning to fade, and Thomas's small hand grew less substantial in mine. "I must return to the others now," he said. "But you will find everything you need to complete our journey in Catherine's journal." She documented every name, every date, every detail necessary to call us home. The shimmering wall began to solidify as the first light of morning touched the windows of the estate. Over the following weeks, I conducted the most extraordinary research of my career, delving into family records that Mrs. Catherine Whitmore had meticulously maintained for decades. Each lost child had been carefully documented, their disappearances recorded with the precise detail of someone who understood that these were not merely tragedies, but crucial elements of a larger supernatural responsibility that would someday require resolution. The process of calling them home proved both simpler and more profound than I had anticipated. Each evening, I would enter the nursery at precisely 9:30, speak the name of one lost child while standing before the shimmering wall, and wait for their emergence from that realm between worlds. The children appeared exactly as they had been at the moment of their disappearance, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of their decades in exile, but retaining the essential innocence of their interrupted childhoods. Margaret emerged on a Tuesday evening in late March, her small dress still crisp with starch from 1843, her dark hair braided exactly as her governess had arranged it on the morning of her disappearance. She took my hand with the same trust Thomas had shown, looked around the familiar nursery with eyes that held both recognition and wonder, and simply said, "Thank you for remembering us." Samuel followed 3 nights later, his school uniform bearing the insignia of a boys' academy that had closed before the turn of the 20th century. Each child carried themselves with a dignity that transcended their apparent age, speaking with voices that held the accumulated wisdom of generations spent in contemplation of family, loss, and the true meaning of home. The final crossing occurred on the 15th of April, exactly 6 months after Mrs. Catherine Whitmore's death. Thomas emerged from the shimmering wall for the last time, no longer translucent, but solid and warm. A 7-year-old boy who had somehow retained his essential nature despite 8 decades of existence in an impossible realm. As he stepped completely into the nursery, the wall behind him returned to ordinary masonry. The phosphorescent glow faded to natural darkness, and the threshold sealed itself permanently. "No, where will you go?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would carry its own mystery. The lost children had gathered in the nursery for this final moment, their faces bearing expressions of peaceful resolution that suggested they had always known this homecoming would eventually occur. "We return to where we belong," Thomas replied, "and not to the world of the living, for that was never our intended destination, but to our proper place in the family's history. We will rest now, as we should have been allowed to rest long ago, without the burden of being trapped between worlds." His explanation carried the authority of someone who had learned to understand mysteries that defied conventional logic. One by one, the children began to fade, not with sorrow or loss, but with the gentle dissolution of a problem finally resolved. Margaret smiled and waved a small hand before becoming transparent as morning mist. Samuel nodded with the grave courtesy of a young gentleman completing a long overdue appointment. Thomas was the last to go, his small figure growing translucent as the first light of dawn touched the nursery windows. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired within the walls of the Whitmore estate. The nursery remained exactly as it had been, but the oppressive weight of accumulated grief that had characterized the space for generations had lifted completely. Room 307 had become simply another chamber in a grand house, notable only for its careful preservation of 19th century furnishings and the subtle scent of lavender that seemed to linger in its corners. Jonathan noticed the change immediately upon his return from a business trip to London. "The house feels different," he remarked during our weekly review of estate matters. "Lighter somehow, as if a burden I never realized we were carrying has finally been lifted." I offered only the observation that old houses sometimes shifted their moods with the changing seasons, an explanation he accepted with the easy satisfaction of someone who had never needed to question the benevolent mysteries of his inheritance. I continue to serve as estate manager for the Whitmore family, maintaining their ancestral home with the same dedication I have provided for more than 3 decades. Yet my role has evolved beyond mere property management into something approaching guardianship of family secrets that span generations. The lost children rest peacefully now, their long exile ended, their names preserved in Mrs. Catherine Whitmore's careful records as testament to a supernatural responsibility finally fulfilled. Some evenings, when I conduct my rounds through the quiet halls of the estate, I still hear the faint echo of childhood laughter drifting through rooms that remember love more clearly than loss.